In the autumn of 1871, authorities in Massachusetts finally forced open the doors of the abandoned Divine Healing Sanctuary on Salem's outskirts, uncovering something that would disturb investigators for generations. Beneath the chapel's floorboards, hidden from view, lay 847 detailed medical journals, each chronicling what appeared to be impossible recoveries. Paralyzed patients walking again. The blind regaining sight. Tumors dissolving overnight. These were not records of divine intervention, however. They represented the painstaking documentation of the most sophisticated medical deception in American history, orchestrated by three brothers who had transformed faith healing into a calculated system of murder. For 37 years, the Hawthorne family operated what thousands believed to be God's own sanctuary of healing. In truth, it functioned as an advanced laboratory of human experimentation that took more than 400 lives. The state of Massachusetts kept these records sealed for half a century, and church authorities have never publicly confirmed their existence. Tonight, we're going to expose the horrifying reality of what actually transpired behind the sacred walls of the Divine Healing Sanctuary. Before we proceed with the Hawthorne brothers' story and their unholy sanctuary, I must ask you something. This channel isn't designed for everyone. Only the most courageous souls who dare to uncover history's darkest buried secrets. If you're among those rare individuals who can confront the truth, regardless of how disturbing, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Also, I'm genuinely curious about where you're listening to this story from. Drop a comment below and share your location. Your willingness to pursue these hidden truths distinguishes you from the ordinary. Now, let's journey back into the shadows of 1834 Massachusetts, where our story of deception and death properly commences. The year was 1834, and Salem, Massachusetts still bore the burden of its notorious history. 42 years had passed since the witch trials, yet the town remained deeply split between established Puritan families and newer Protestant groups seeking to assert their spiritual influence. The Second Great Awakening had swept through New England like an uncontrolled blaze, bringing intense belief in divine intervention and miraculous recovery that challenged traditional Calvinist teachings. Into this climate of religious tension and spiritual yearning arrived three brothers who would permanently transform the meaning of sacred healing throughout America. Dr. Cornelius Hawthorne, 38 years old, had pursued medical education at Harvard before spending 5 years in Europe observing the expanding phenomenon of medical tourism and faith healing. His younger brother, Reverend Obadiah Hawthorne, 35, possessed an imposing presence and a voice capable of moving entire congregations to tears with passionate sermons about God's restorative power. The youngest, Ezekiel Hawthorne, 32, had apprenticed as an apothecary in Boston and developed an almost uncanny understanding of herbs, minerals, and chemical compounds unmatched by most in New England. The brothers acquired a sprawling colonial estate on Salem's outskirts, a property deserted since 1692 when its original owners fled during the witchcraft hysteria. This three-story wooden structure occupied 12 acres surrounded by dense pine forests offering perfect seclusion from curious observers. They immediately commenced renovations, converting the main house into what they designated the Divine Healing Sanctuary, complete with a chapel, patient accommodations, and what they described to visitors as a basement prayer meditation chamber. What the brothers deliberately concealed was the advanced laboratory they constructed beneath the chapel, reachable only through a hidden entrance behind the altar. Here, Ezekiel established what would become Massachusetts's most sophisticated chemical operation, featuring glass distillation equipment imported from Germany, hundreds of ceramic containers holding various powders and liquids, and detailed anatomical diagrams mapping the human nervous system with alarming precision. The Hawthorne brothers grasped something that other faith healers of their time completely overlooked: the importance of specificity. While traveling preachers claimed general healing powers, the Hawthornes specialized in what they termed miraculous cures for incurable conditions. They focused on three particular ailments that 1830s medical science couldn't address: sudden onset paralysis, unexplained blindness, and rapidly developing tumors. Each condition, they asserted, could be reversed through intensive prayer and divine intervention, but only at their sanctuary, and only for those possessing sufficient faith and financial resources. The brothers built their reputation methodically. Cornelius leveraged his medical credentials to cultivate relationships with physicians throughout New England, presenting himself as a doctor humble enough to acknowledge science's limitations when confronting God's superior power. Obadiah traveled to churches across Massachusetts, delivering sermons about faith and healing that held congregations spellbound. Meanwhile, Ezekiel worked quietly in the background, developing what he called his divine compounds, substances capable of creating precisely the conditions his brothers claimed to cure. By spring 1835, the Divine Healing Sanctuary had received its first patients, and news of the Hawthorne brothers' extraordinary capabilities began spreading throughout New England. What none of these patients realized was that they were entering the most advanced medical fraud in American history, an operation that would exploit human desperation and faith for more than 3 decades. The brothers had absorbed a crucial lesson from observing other fraudulent healers: the importance of documentation. Every patient entering their sanctuary was photographed before and after treatment, their conditions meticulously recorded in leather-bound journals maintained with scientific precision by Cornelius. These records, they claimed, demonstrated God's work through their ministry. In reality, they represented detailed documentation of a criminal enterprise that would eventually claim hundreds of lives. The Hawthorne brothers' operation began with what they called divine selection. Cornelius would attend medical conferences and visit physicians' offices throughout New England, carefully studying patient records and identifying individuals whose conditions had deteriorated beyond medical help. He maintained detailed correspondence with doctors, positioning himself as a colleague interested in desperate cases where only divine intervention remained possible. But the brothers' true brilliance lay in their parallel operation, the systematic creation of patients who appeared to need miraculous healing. Ezekiel had spent years developing what he termed his reversible affliction compounds, chemical preparations capable of inducing specific symptoms perfectly mimicking serious medical conditions. His masterpiece was a powder derived from a rare South American plant that, when administered in precise doses, could cause temporary paralysis lasting anywhere from 2 weeks to 3 months depending on concentration. The brothers' method was diabolically straightforward. They would identify healthy individuals from wealthy families, often targeting those traveling alone or visiting Salem for business. Through carefully orchestrated chance encounters, they would invite these individuals to tour their sanctuary, where Ezekiel would serve them tea laced with his compounds. Within days, victims would begin experiencing symptoms: gradual loss of sensation in their limbs, mysterious vision disturbances, or the appearance of what seemed like rapidly growing tumors, actually wax formations injected under the skin while victims were unconscious. When these manufactured patients began showing symptoms, the brothers would discover their conditions during routine conversations, expressing deep concern and offering their sanctuary services. The terrified victims, frightened by their sudden afflictions and desperate for assistance, would readily accept treatment. The brothers would then extensively document their conditions, creating before and after photographs serving as proof of their miraculous healing abilities. The healing process was theatrical and convincing. Obadiah would conduct elaborate prayer sessions often lasting several hours while Cornelius administered what he called divine medicine, actually the antidotes Ezekiel had developed for each compound. Paralysis would fade, vision would return, and wax tumors would be skillfully removed during nighttime divine surgery performed while patients were sedated. The brothers charged enormous fees for their services, typically demanding between $500 and $2,000 per patient, fortunes representing lifetime savings for most families. They justified these costs by claiming that genuine divine healing required substantial sacrifice and that their ministry needed funding to continue God's work. Most families gladly paid, believing they were witnessing authentic miracles. Word of the Hawthorne brothers' success spread throughout New England and beyond. By 1837, they were receiving letters from families across America begging for help with genuinely ill relatives. The brothers found themselves in a predicament. They had built their reputation on a 100% success rate, yet now they were being asked to treat patients with real incurable conditions. Their solution was as cold-blooded as it was logical. When patients arrived with genuine medical conditions, actual paralysis from strokes, real tumors, or hereditary blindness, the brothers would conduct their usual elaborate ceremonies. But instead of administering healing compounds, Ezekiel would prepare what he called divine transition medicine, carefully calculated doses of morphine and other substances causing patients to die peacefully in their sleep. The brothers would then explain to grieving families that their loved ones had been called home by God just as healing was about to occur. They would offer elaborate theological explanations about divine timing and the mysteries of God's plan while privately documenting these deaths in separate journals locked away in their basement laboratory. This dual operation, manufacturing miracles for healthy patients while quietly eliminating genuinely sick ones, allowed the brothers to maintain their supernatural healing reputation while generating enormous profits. They understood that in an era when medical knowledge was limited and faith was strong, families would rather believe in divine mystery than question seemingly miraculous healing. Margaret Whitmore arrived at the Divine Healing Sanctuary on a gray October morning in 1839, carrying a letter of introduction from a Boston physician and a heart heavy with desperation. Her 22-year-old daughter Sarah had begun experiencing strange symptoms 3 weeks earlier: sudden dizzy spells, gradual vision loss in her left eye, and growing hand weakness making simple tasks impossible. Margaret had spent her late husband's entire legacy seeking treatment for Sarah in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, yet no physician could explain her daughter's condition. When Dr. Cornelius Hawthorne contacted her through their family physician, claiming he had successfully treated identical cases through divine intervention. Margaret saw it as an answer to her prayers. The Hawthorne brothers welcomed Margaret and Sarah with the warmth and authority that had built their reputation. Cornelius examined Sarah with practiced professionalism, asking detailed questions about her symptoms while taking careful notes. Obadiah prayed over the young woman with passionate intensity, declaring that he could sense divine healing energy surrounding her case. Meanwhile, Ezekiel prepared what he called preparatory medicine to help Sarah's body ready itself for healing. What Margaret didn't know was that Sarah's symptoms perfectly matched the effects of one of Ezekiel's compounds, a substance he had administered to her during a carefully orchestrated meeting at a Boston coffee house 2 months earlier. Sarah was not genuinely ill. She was one of the brothers' manufactured patients, selected because her family's wealth made them ideal targets for their expensive healing services. Margaret agreed to pay the brothers' fee of $1,200 and arranged for Sarah to stay at the sanctuary for intensive treatment. For the next 3 weeks, she watched her daughter undergo elaborate healing ceremonies, consume specially prepared medicines, and participate in extended prayer sessions that seemed to gradually restore her health. Sarah's vision began returning, her strength improved, and the dizzy spells became less frequent. On November 15, 1839, Sarah experienced what appeared to be complete recovery. Her vision was fully restored, her hands steady, and she felt stronger than she had in months. Margaret wept with joy, praising God for the miracle she had witnessed. The brothers photographed Sarah before and after her treatment, adding her case to their growing collection of documented healings. But Margaret's gratitude turned to suspicion when she discovered something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. While packing Sarah's belongings for departure, she accidentally knocked over a small wooden box in Sarah's room. The box opened, revealing a collection of brown glass vials, each labeled with strange symbols and containing different colored powders and liquids. Margaret had worked as a school teacher before her marriage and had always been curious about scientific matters. She carefully copied the symbols from the vials onto paper, planning to ask a pharmacist about them when she returned to Boston. But when she showed the symbols to Mr. Henley, the apothecary who had supplied medicines to her family for years, his face went pale. "Mrs. Whitmore," he whispered, glancing around his shop to ensure they were alone. "These are not healing compounds. This symbol here indicates belladonna extract, a poison causing vision problems and weakness. This one is wolfsbane, which creates paralysis. And this," he pointed to a symbol resembling a twisted tree, "is something I've never seen before, but the notation suggests it's an antidote compound." Margaret felt the world shift beneath her feet. If the vials contained poisons and antidotes, then Sarah's illness had been artificially created, and her healing had been nothing more than an elaborate performance. She returned to Salem that same evening, determined to confront the Hawthorne brothers and demand an explanation. However, when she arrived at the sanctuary, she found the brothers prepared for her visit. They welcomed her warmly, expressing concern about her obvious distress. When she produced the paper with the copied symbols, Cornelius examined it with apparent confusion. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said gently, "I'm afraid someone has played a cruel joke on you. These symbols are from an old alchemical text, medieval superstitions having nothing to do with modern medicine or divine healing. Perhaps someone placed those vials in Sarah's room to test your faith or cause doubt about the miracle you witnessed." Obadiah nodded gravely. "Satan often attacks those who have witnessed God's power, Mrs. Whitmore. He seeks to plant seeds of doubt about divine healing through deception and confusion. You must not let these mysterious vials diminish the reality of your daughter's healing." Margaret wanted to believe them, yet something in their manner, a subtle tension, a too careful choice of words, made her increasingly suspicious. She decided to investigate further, beginning with other families who claimed to have experienced miracles at the sanctuary. Margaret's investigation led her to the Peabody family of Concord, whose son had supposedly been healed of sudden paralysis 6 months earlier. When she spoke with Mrs. Peabody, she discovered disturbing similarities between their cases. Like Sarah, young Thomas Peabody had developed his symptoms gradually after a chance encounter with a stranger in a public place. Like Sarah, his condition had followed a specific pattern: weakness, then partial paralysis, then gradual recovery during sanctuary treatment. But Mrs. Peabody revealed something that made Margaret's blood run cold. During Thomas's treatment, she had noticed that Ezekiel Hawthorne seemed to know exactly which medicines to prepare and when to administer them, as if following a predetermined schedule rather than responding to her son's condition. When she had commented on this to Cornelius, he had explained that divine healing often followed God's perfect timing, but she had found his answer unsatisfying. Margaret continued her investigation, tracking down 12 families who had brought patients to the sanctuary over the past 4 years. In every case, she found the same pattern: sudden onset of symptoms following chance encounters with strangers, gradual deterioration, then complete recovery during Hawthorne brothers' treatment. The symptoms were always the same: paralysis, vision problems, or mysterious tumors appearing and disappearing without explanation. But Margaret also discovered something else that filled her with horror. 3 families told her about patients who had died during sanctuary treatment, genuinely ill individuals who had come seeking healing for real conditions. In each case, the brothers had explained that the patients had been called home by God just as healing was about to occur. The families had accepted these explanations, finding comfort in believing their loved ones had been welcomed into heaven. Margaret realized that the Hawthorne brothers were operating 2 separate schemes simultaneously. They were creating artificial illnesses in healthy patients, then charging enormous fees to cure them, while systematically eliminating genuinely ill patients to maintain their successful healing reputation. The scope of their deception was staggering, and the human cost was becoming clear. She decided to return to the sanctuary one final time, not as a grateful patient's mother, but as an investigator determined to expose the truth. She arrived on a snowy December evening, telling the brothers she wanted to make a substantial donation to their ministry in gratitude for Sarah's healing. They welcomed her warmly, inviting her to stay for dinner and tour their facilities. During the meal, Margaret carefully steered the conversation toward their healing methods, asking detailed questions about their success rate and the types of conditions they treated. The brothers spoke confidently about their 100% success rate, explaining they only accepted patients whom God had chosen for healing. When Margaret asked about patients who had died during treatment, they explained these individuals had been called home after their healing was complete, but in a spiritual rather than physical sense. After dinner, Obadiah offered to show Margaret their private chapel where they conducted their most intensive healing ceremonies. As they walked through the sanctuary, Margaret noticed details she had missed during previous visits: the unusually thick walls, the sound dampening seemingly designed to prevent noise traveling between rooms, and the careful furniture placement that could conceal hidden doors or passages. When they reached the chapel, Margaret excused herself to use the necessary, but instead of leaving the building, she hid behind a large wooden cabinet near the altar. She waited until she heard the brothers retire to their private quarters, then began exploring the chapel more thoroughly. Her persistence was rewarded when she discovered a loose floorboard behind the altar. Lifting it revealed a narrow staircase descending into darkness. Despite her fear, Margaret descended into what she would later describe as the most horrifying sight of my life: a fully equipped laboratory containing hundreds of glass vessels, detailed anatomical charts, and rows of leather-bound journals filled with the brothers' meticulous documentation of their crimes. The basement laboratory beneath the Divine Healing Sanctuary was a testament to the Hawthorne brothers' methodical approach to their criminal enterprise. Margaret found herself in a space carved from the foundation and expanded to span nearly the entire building's footprint above. The walls were lined with sturdy wooden shelves holding hundreds of glass containers, each carefully labeled with symbols corresponding to different compounds and their effects. Along one wall, Margaret discovered Ezekiel's chemical apparatus, a sophisticated arrangement of glass tubes, heated vessels, and distillation equipment that would have impressed any university laboratory. Tables were covered with scales, measuring devices, and notebooks filled with precise calculations and chemical formulas. The air carried a strange mixture of odors, sweet floral scents mixed with bitter medicinal smells that made Margaret's eyes water. But it was the documentation that truly revealed the operation's scope. Margaret found herself looking at shelves lined with leather-bound journals, each meticulously organized by year and patient type. The journals were divided into 2 distinct categories: divine healings and divine transitions. The first category contained detailed records of patients artificially afflicted and then cured, while the second documented those quietly eliminated. Opening one divine healing journal, Margaret found entries reading like scientific case studies. Each patient was assigned a number, and their treatment was documented with frightening precision. She read entries like, patient 47, administered compound C7 paralysis inducer at 3.2 ratio mixed with chamomile tea. Symptoms appeared within 72 hours as predicted. Subject experienced complete lower body paralysis by day 8. Administered antidote C7 during healing ceremony day 21. Full recovery achieved within 48 hours. Payment received $800. Photograph documentation complete. The Divine Transition journals were even more disturbing. These entries documented the systematic murder of genuinely ill patients with clinical detachment that made Margaret's hands shake as she read, patient 23, genuine paralysis from stroke. Administered compound X4 morphine derivative during evening prayer session. Subject expired peacefully at 11:30 p.m. Family informed of divine calling. Payment received $1,500. Body prepared for burial with standard preparation compounds to prevent detection. Margaret discovered that the brothers had been perfecting their methods for years, developing increasingly sophisticated compounds capable of mimicking virtually any medical condition. Ezekiel's notebooks contained detailed research on the human nervous system, circulation, and various plant and mineral compounds' effects on different organs. He had essentially created a catalog of artificial diseases and their corresponding cures. In one laboratory corner, Margaret found what appeared to be a small surgical area complete with a table, instruments, and containers of what looked like medical supplies. She realized this was where the brothers performed their divine surgery to remove wax tumors they had implanted in patients while unconscious. The precision and planning involved in their operation was staggering. Perhaps most disturbing was Margaret's discovery of a detailed ledger tracking the brothers' financial success. Over 5 years, they had generated over $40,000 in payments from patients, an enormous fortune representing the combined life savings of dozens of families. The ledger also contained expansion plans, including correspondence with potential associates in other states interested in establishing similar divine healing operations. Margaret spent 3 hours in the laboratory copying as many names and details as possible from the brothers' journals. She found records of patients she had interviewed during her investigation, confirming her suspicions about their illnesses' artificial nature, but she also found evidence of crimes extending far beyond medical fraud. The brothers had been systematically murdering patients for years, and their success had made them increasingly bold in their methods. As she prepared to leave the laboratory, Margaret heard footsteps above her in the chapel. The brothers had discovered her absence and were searching for her. She quickly replaced the journals and climbed the stairs, but as she reached the top, she found herself face to face with Cornelius Hawthorne holding a lantern and wearing an expression of cold fury. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said quietly, "I'm afraid you've seen things not meant for your eyes." The confrontation between Margaret Whitmore and the Hawthorne brothers in the candlelit chapel would later be described in court documents as the moment when years of carefully constructed deception collided with unshakable determination for truth. Cornelius stood blocking the hidden laboratory entrance, his medical bag in one hand and lantern in the other, while Obadiah and Ezekiel emerged from shadows near the altar. "Mrs. Whitmore," Obadiah said, his voice carrying the same authoritative tone used during healing ceremonies, "you have wandered into sanctuary areas reserved for private prayer and meditation. I'm afraid you may have misunderstood what you've seen." Margaret, still clutching papers where she had copied information from the brothers' journals, faced the 3 men with courage surprising even herself. "I understand perfectly what I've seen," she replied, her voice steady despite fear. "I've seen records of your crimes, the poisons used to create artificial illnesses, the antidotes administered as fake cures, and documentation of the murders you've committed." The brothers exchanged glances, and Margaret saw something shift in their demeanor. The masks of religious authority and medical compassion fell away, revealing cold calculation that had driven their operation for years. "You're speaking of things you couldn't possibly understand," Cornelius said, stepping closer. "The work we do here represents healing's highest form. We give people hope, strengthen their faith, and provide experiences transforming their lives. The methods we use are irrelevant compared to spiritual benefits provided." "Spiritual benefits?" Margaret's voice rose despite attempts to remain calm. "You've been poisoning healthy people and murdering sick ones. You've stolen fortunes from desperate families and built your reputation on systematic fraud and murder." Ezekiel, silent until now, spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Mrs. Whitmore, you have 2 choices. You can leave this sanctuary tonight and never speak of what you think you've seen, or you can join the patients who have been called home by God during their healing process." The threat was clear, but Margaret had prepared for this moment. During her investigation, she had written detailed letters to Boston authorities describing her suspicions and gathered evidence. She had left these letters with her attorney with instructions to deliver them to the Massachusetts Attorney General if she failed to return from Salem by a specific date. "I'm afraid it's too late for threats," she told the brothers. "I've already documented everything discovered about your operation. If something happens to me, authorities will know exactly where to look and what to investigate." The brothers realized they faced a situation they had never encountered before, a witness who had not only uncovered their methods but had also prepared for possible retaliation. For the first time in their criminal careers, they were dealing with someone methodical in gathering evidence and protecting herself. Cornelius made a decision that would ultimately seal their fate. Rather than attempting to harm Margaret, he chose one final deception attempt. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, his voice taking on a pleading tone, "I can see you're a woman of intelligence and compassion. What if I told you that our work, unconventional as it may seem, has brought comfort to hundreds of families? What if I explained that sometimes healing's appearance is just as beneficial as actual healing?" "You're asking me to become complicit in murder," Margaret replied. "I've seen your records. I know how many genuinely sick patients you've killed to maintain your reputation. The conversation continued for another hour with the brothers alternating between threats, bribes, and justification attempts. They offered Margaret substantial money to remain silent, promised to cease their operation if she would agree to keep their secrets, and even suggested she could become a partner in their enterprise. But Margaret remained unmoved. Finally, Obadiah made a statement later used as evidence of premeditation in their trial. "Mrs. Whitmore, you have forced us into a position where we must choose between our life's work and your silence. We have spent years building something meaningful to people's lives, and we cannot allow one person's misguided sense of justice to destroy everything we've accomplished." Margaret recognized this as a final threat, but she also understood the brothers now operated from desperation rather than their usual calculated control. She backed toward the chapel door, keeping her eyes on the three men while reaching for the handle. "I'm leaving now," she said firmly. "And I'm going to ensure authorities know exactly what you've been doing here. Families who have lost loved ones deserve truth, and people you've defrauded deserve justice." She opened the door and stepped into the cold December night, but as she walked away from the sanctuary, she heard Ezekiel call out behind her, "Mrs. Whitmore, you have no idea what you've set in motion. Our work here is bigger than you understand, and there are others who will continue what we've started." Margaret didn't look back as she walked through snow towards Salem, but she carried knowledge that she had uncovered one of American history's most sophisticated criminal enterprises. What she didn't know was that her investigation would ultimately reveal connections to similar operations in other states and that the Hawthorne brothers' network extended far beyond their small Massachusetts sanctuary. Margaret's revelations to Massachusetts authorities triggered an investigation that would ultimately expose a criminal network spanning multiple states involving dozens of individuals. When Sheriff Thomas Hartwell and his deputies arrived at the Divine Healing Sanctuary on December 22, 1839, they found the brothers had fled during the night, leaving behind only their extensive documentation and laboratory equipment. The investigation revealed that the Hawthorne brothers had been corresponding with similar operations in Connecticut, New York, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. Their letters, found in a locked chest in Cornelius's room, showed they had been sharing techniques and compounds with other fraudulent healers, creating a coordinated medical fraud network operating for nearly a decade. District Attorney William Morrison, who led the prosecution, later described the investigation's scope as unprecedented in American criminal history. The brothers had maintained correspondence with 17 different individuals operating similar schemes, ranging from small-scale operations targeting individual families to large sanctuaries attracting patients from across the region. The investigation revealed that the network had developed standardized methods for creating artificial illnesses, training procedures for new operators, and even a system for sharing information about wealthy families potentially targeted for their schemes. The brothers had essentially been franchising their operation, providing compounds and techniques to associates in exchange for profit percentages. When authorities raided the other locations identified in the brothers' correspondence, they found evidence of similar operations in Hartford, Albany, Philadelphia, and Richmond. The coordinated raids conducted simultaneously on January 15, 1840 resulted in 14 individuals' arrests and recovery of extensive documentation revealing the network's true scope. The evidence showed the network had been responsible for over 400 genuinely ill patients' deaths across 5 states while defrauding thousands of families of their life savings. The artificial illness schemes had generated over $200,000 in fraudulent payments, making it one of American history's most financially successful criminal enterprises at that time. But the investigation also revealed something horrifying even to experienced law enforcement officials. The brothers had been conducting what they called compound research using unwilling subjects. Their laboratory contained detailed documentation of experiments performed on patients given increasingly dangerous chemical combinations to test effects on the human body. Sheriff Hartwell's official report described finding evidence of systematic human experimentation rivaling the most disturbing accounts of medical abuse in European history. The brothers had been using their patients as test subjects for developing new compounds, carefully documenting various chemical combinations' results and their effects on different organs and systems. The manhunt for the Hawthorne brothers extended across multiple states with wanted posters distributed throughout New England and beyond. Federal marshals became involved when evidence suggested the brothers had fled to territories beyond state jurisdiction. The search was complicated by the fact that the brothers had maintained multiple identities and established safe houses in several locations. Margaret Whitmore became the prosecution's key witness, providing detailed testimony about her laboratory discovery and confrontation with the brothers. Her careful documentation of evidence proved crucial in establishing their crime's scope and operation's systematic nature. The trial, when it finally began in September 1840, attracted national attention. Newspapers across the country covered proceedings, and the courtroom was packed with victims' family members, medical professionals, and religious leaders wanting to understand how such elaborate deception had been maintained so long. The prosecution presented evidence painting a picture of calculated cruelty and systematic exploitation of human desperation. Witness after witness testified about their experiences with the brothers, describing artificial illnesses suffered and enormous fees paid for fake cures. Families of patients who had died during treatment testified about their losses, finally understanding their loved ones had been murdered rather than called home by God. The defense attempted to argue that the brothers had genuinely believed in their healing abilities and had only documented their methods to better understand divine intervention. But extensive evidence of premeditation, systematic crimes, and clear financial motivations made this argument impossible to sustain. When the time comes to reveal the final truth about the Hawthorne brothers network, remember you're among the select few courageous enough to hear these darkest secrets of American history. If you've made it this far, you're not like most people. You're someone seeking truth regardless of how disturbing it might be. Hit that like button if this investigation sends chills down your spine, and don't forget to subscribe for more hidden stories few channels dare to tell. Share this video with someone who loves dark mysteries, because together we're uncovering secrets buried for over a century. The Hawthorne brothers' trial took an unexpected turn when Ezekiel Hawthorne, the youngest brother and chemical operation mastermind, was captured in Baltimore in November 1840. Unlike his brothers maintaining innocence and claiming genuine healing, Ezekiel chose to cooperate with authorities in exchange for reduced sentence. His testimony delivered over 3 days in a packed courtroom revealed details about their operation shocking even prosecutors investigating the case for nearly a year. Ezekiel explained that their network had been developing what they called medical theater, elaborate performances designed to simulate miraculous healing while generating enormous profits from desperate families. We understood, Ezekiel testified, that people needed to believe in miracles more than they needed actual healing. Our artificial illnesses and cures provided experiences strengthening their faith and giving hope, even if medical effects were temporary. We saw ourselves providing services doctors and traditional healers couldn't offer. But Ezekiel's testimony also revealed cold calculation behind their systematic murders. When asked about patients dying during treatment, he explained their reasoning with chilling logic. Genuinely ill patients presented reputation problems. We had built success on 100% healing rates and couldn't allow real diseases to damage our credibility. Transition medicine ensured these patients died peacefully, and families found comfort believing they had been called home by God. The prosecution then presented evidence forever changing how the case was understood. Hidden in Ezekiel's Baltimore laboratory, authorities discovered journals documenting what he called advanced research, experiments conducted on patients without knowledge or consent. These experiments had tested various compounds' effects on the human body, with results later used to develop more sophisticated artificial illnesses. The journals revealed the brothers had been using patients as test subjects for chemical combinations creating virtually any imaginable symptom. They had developed compounds causing temporary blindness, paralysis, skin conditions, respiratory problems, and even mental confusion. Each compound had been tested on multiple patients with results carefully documented for future use. But the most disturbing revelation came when Ezekiel described their long-term goals. The brothers had been working toward what they called medical legitimacy, planning to eventually transition from fraudulent healing to recognized medical researchers. They intended to use accumulated wealth and documented research to establish a legitimate medical institution where they could continue human experiments under scientific advancement guise. We believed, Ezekiel testified, that our research would eventually contribute to genuine medical breakthroughs. The compounds we developed and systematic documentation of their effects represented valuable scientific knowledge benefiting humanity. The methods we used were necessary to advance medical understanding in ways traditional research could never achieve. The prosecution's final witness was Dr. Henry Patterson, a Harvard Medical School physician asked to review the brothers' research documents. His testimony provided scientific context helping the jury understand their crime's true nature. What the Hawthorne brothers created, Dr. Patterson explained, was not medical research, but systematic human experimentation conducted without consent and designed primarily for financial gain. Their compounds were not treatments, but weapons used to create artificial suffering for profit. Their documentation, while scientifically detailed, represents evidence of calculated cruelty rather than medical advancement. The jury deliberated only 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. The brothers were sentenced to death for murder, with the judge declaring their crimes represented an assault on trust foundations between healers and patients and a perversion of religious faith demanding ultimate punishment. But even as justice seemed assured, the Hawthorne network's full scope continued unfolding. Ezekiel's cooperation led authorities to a hidden Boston warehouse where the brothers had stored accumulated wealth and research materials. The warehouse contained over $60,000 in cash and gold, hundreds of chemical compounds, and what prosecutors described as American history's most comprehensive human experimentation data collection. Among the materials was a leather-bound ledger Ezekiel called his master research journal. This document contained detailed plans for nationwide expansion with specific major city targets and correspondence with potential associates as far west as St. Louis and as far south as New Orleans. The brothers had envisioned creating fraudulent healing sanctuaries spanning the entire country. The ledger also revealed they had been developing advanced compounds, chemical preparations creating symptoms indistinguishable from serious diseases like consumption, heart conditions, and even certain madness forms. They had planned to expand beyond traditional paralysis, blindness, and tumors to encompass virtually every major medical condition known to 19th-century medicine. Perhaps most chilling was discovering what Ezekiel called his elimination protocols, detailed procedures for killing patients in ways appearing natural and attributable to existing conditions. The brothers had developed methods for inducing heart failure, respiratory collapse, and even strokes, leaving no foul play traces during limited autopsies performed in that era. Cornelius and Obadiah Hawthorne's execution on March 15, 1841 marked their criminal career's end, but not their influence on American medical fraud. Ezekiel, whose cooperation secured life sentence rather than execution, continued providing information about similar operations across the country for several years after his brothers' deaths. His revelations led to discovering fraudulent healing operations in 12 additional states, resulting in over 50 arrests and evidence recovery documenting crimes spanning nearly 2 decades. The Hawthorne Network, as investigators came to call it, had been far more extensive than anyone initially realized. The investigation revealed the brothers had been training associates in their methods since 1836, providing detailed instruction manuals and starter compound supplies to individuals wanting to establish their own fraudulent healing operations. These associates had been operating independently while sharing information and techniques with the central network, creating criminal activity webs extending from Maine to Georgia. One of the most disturbing discoveries was correspondence between Ezekiel and a Charleston, South Carolina physician discussing using their compounds to create artificial slave illnesses for propaganda purposes. The letters suggested some slaveholders had considered using fraudulent healing demonstrations to support claims about slavery's beneficial effects on African American health. The medical community's response to Hawthorne revelations was swift and comprehensive. Medical schools began requiring fraudulent treatment identification courses, and professional medical associations established committees investigating suspicious healing claims. The case became a turning point in American medical practice, leading to increased regulation and oversight of alternative healing methods. Religious communities were equally affected by the scandal. Many denominations issued official statements distancing themselves from faith healing practices and establishing guidelines for evaluating miraculous healing claims. The Hawthorne case became a cautionary tale about mixing religious faith with medical treatment and influenced theological discussions about divine intervention nature for decades. But perhaps the Hawthorne case's most lasting impact was its effect on public trust in medical authority. Revelation that respected physicians could engage in such systematic deception led to increased skepticism about medical claims and greater demand for evidence-based treatment. The case contributed to developing more rigorous medical testing procedures and ethical guidelines, eventually evolving into modern medical standards. Margaret Whitmore, whose courage exposed the entire network, became a prominent medical reform and patient rights advocate. She used her experience to establish one of America's first patient advocacy organizations, educating families about medical fraud and supporting fraudulent treatment victims. Her work led to Massachusetts's first medical fraud prevention laws in 1845, requiring healers to provide training evidence and prohibiting undisclosed substance administration to patients. These laws became models for similar legislation in other states and helped establish modern medical regulations' legal framework. In 1871, 30 years after the Hawthorne brothers' execution, authorities received an unexpected letter from Massachusetts State Prison. Ezekiel Hawthorne, now 69 and dying of consumption, requested a final meeting with investigators to reveal what he called complete truth about their operation. The meeting, held in the prison infirmary on a cold February morning, would provide final pieces of a puzzle haunting investigators for 3 decades. Ezekiel, his voice weakened by illness but mind still sharp, began with an admission stunning even experienced investigators. "Everything you discovered about our operation," he whispered, "was only the surface of what we accomplished. The artificial illnesses, murders, financial fraud, these were simply visible aspects of a much larger experiment in human behavior and social control." Ezekiel revealed the brothers had been conducting what they called faith manipulation research, systematic studies of how religious belief could be exploited to control human behavior. Their healing ceremonies had been designed not just to generate profits, but to gather data about psychological mechanisms governing faith, hope, and desperation. We documented everything, Ezekiel explained. Every patient's reactions, every family's responses, every community's interpretation of our work. We were creating comprehensive understanding of how human beings respond to miraculous intervention promises. Our journals contained far more than medical data. They were detailed psychological profiles of human vulnerability. The implications of this revelation were staggering. The brothers had essentially been conducting one of American history's first systematic psychological manipulation studies, using patients as unwitting subjects in experiments designed to understand human gullibility limits and false hope's power. Ezekiel also revealed their network had been sharing this psychological data with associates using it for purposes beyond medical fraud. Some associates were politicians interested in understanding public opinion manipulation, while others were businessmen seeking more effective advertising and sales techniques. We proved, Ezekiel said, his voice barely audible, that human beings will believe almost anything if presented with sufficient authority and wrapped in miraculous intervention promise. Our research showed that people's need to believe in the impossible is so strong they will ignore obvious deception evidence if maintaining faith provides emotional comfort. But Ezekiel's final revelation was perhaps the most disturbing of all. In a metal box hidden beneath his cell floorboards, he had preserved a single journal containing what he called his ultimate research, detailed plans for using their psychological manipulation techniques on massive scale. The journal outlined strategies for creating artificial crises resolvable through fraudulent interventions, methods for identifying and exploiting community vulnerabilities, and techniques for maintaining long-term deception through careful evidence and witness management. It was, investigators realized, a comprehensive manual for large-scale social manipulation disguised as scientific research. Our work at the sanctuary, Ezekiel concluded, was never really about healing or even about money. It was about proving that human society is built on foundations systematically undermined by